a series of emails released by the New York Post, Hunter Biden, the son of Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden, allegedly went after a deal with China's largest private energy company. I'll be going into this. Meanwhile, leaked documents obtained by the Epoch Times show the Chinese regime launched a program in 2018 to target U.S. and Western embassies in China. I'll also have more on this as well. And history is being rewritten in the United States, and the story being taught to children in today's schools is one that frames America as a government built on racism and slavery. But is this really the case? I'll be speaking with Alex Newman about this, so stay tuned for that. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. Now, first off, some U.S. news. Hunter Biden, the son of Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden, allegedly went after a deal with China's largest private energy company and allegedly said in an email it would be, quote, interesting for me and my family. The leaked email was published exclusively by the New York Post and claimed to be from a computer that was dropped off at a repair shop and never retrieved. The computer was later seized by the FBI, but not before the repair shop owner made a copy of the hard drive and later gave it to former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani's lawyer. The contents were shared with the New York Post by Giuliani. The Post states that in one email allegedly sent by Hunter Biden on May 13, 2017, includes emails on, quote, remuneration packages for 6 people that it says were involved in an unspecified business venture. It also claims that Hunter Biden was identified as a chair/vice chair, depending on agreement with CEFC, that Chinese company, and said he was paid at least $850. It's not clear what that was exactly. Now, the validity of the emails can't be independently confirmed. We made an effort, we can't get them, given that they were allegedly leaks provided exclusively to the New York Post by Giuliani. They align with findings, though, from a recent Senate report by the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs and the Committee on Finance. Now, among the numerous claims in that Senate report on Hunter Biden was a section on his alleged ties to CEFC, including to the company's founder, Ye Jianming, who it notes has ties to the Chinese military as well. Now, that 87-page Senate report states that Hunter Biden and Devon Archer, who's Biden's business partner, quote, engaged in numerous financial transactions with Chinese nationals who had deep connections to the communist Chinese government. And it adds that, quote, Hunter Biden has extensive connections to Chinese businesses and Chinese foreign nationals that are linked to the communist government. The report details Hunter Biden's connections and points to open source research on that, so you can independently verify it. Now, the Joe Biden presidential campaign, meanwhile, denies the findings from that report. Now, this also follows an incident around a similar report on Hunter Biden yesterday. Twitter and Facebook are under fire for censoring an article by the New York Post, which included documents and photographs of Hunter Biden and an email where he allegedly introduced Joe Biden to a top executive at a Ukrainian natural gas company.
Did you and your father ever discuss Ukraine?
No. As I said, the only time was after a news account, and it wasn't a discussion in any way. There's no but to this. No, we never did.
Now, Facebook used its so-called fact checkers to censor the article, and Twitter used more direct censorship by actually blocking the article on the platform, including if people attempted to share it. Now, Twitter even locked the personal account of the White House press secretary for sharing the article, and the Trump War Room Twitter account called out the move as being done to stop the spread of news that, quote, Democrats don't like. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey then came out on Twitter and declared that the company's handling of the article was unacceptable, mainly on the grounds of methods it used to block the article. He stated on Twitter, quote, our communication around our actions on the New York Post article was not great, and blocking URL sharing via tweet or DM with zero context as to why we're blocking unacceptable. Now, that move drew broad criticism as well as calls for investigations into Twitter and Facebook for political censorship. Senator Josh Hawley was among them. He wrote on Twitter that Jack Dorsey's apology was not enough and was, quote, downright insulting. He added he will ask Twitter and Facebook to, quote, give an explanation under oath to the Senate subcommittee I chair. These are potential violations of election law, and that's a crime. Now, on the documents themselves, the Biden campaign again denied the legitimacy of the links. And again, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who has been involved in the links, said there's much more to come. Giuliani said in an interview on OANN that the Post has published about 5% of what's on that hard drive, and, quote, have at least 2 more situations more serious than this. And he added, quote, the real big money corruption takes place with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, folks, if you want to learn more about this, we interviewed recently M.A. Taylor. He's the director of Riding the Dragon, which details some of the different claims on Hunter Biden, again using open source information.
China is not our enemy.
Not a problem.
What are we worried about? Come on, man.
He doesn't see them as a threat.
And I believed then what I believe now, that a rising China is a positive development.
You can find that interview on our channel. Now, meanwhile, in some other news, the Chinese regime launched a program in 2018 to target U.S. and Western embassies in China, which could give some insights on the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston and the CCP's closure of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, China. This is from leaked internal documents obtained by the Epoch Times. Now, the April 5th, 2018 document is from the Leizhou Foreign Affairs Bureau from Guangdong Province in China. It details a plan for what the CCP describes as, quote, preventing and combating the infiltration of hostile forces to, quote, maintain political security. It details a plan to, quote, prevent the penetration and destruction of the U.S. and Western embassies and consulates in China. Now, it says the goal is to keep them away from important political persons, lawyers, public intellectuals, and human rights activists in the country. Now, folks, what does this mean? What is political security? What is the meaning of that term, political security? For the Chinese Communist Party, this means the security of the CCP itself. It means protecting the CCP itself and the interests of the CCP. As we reported previously, Xi Jinping has formed a new police branch in China focused on political security. We noted a lot of that's likely going to be focused on internal purges within the party, going after CCP officials who are deviating from the party line or who are trying to align more with Western narratives. And in this leaked document, we see that way back in 2018, they were doing things similar to this. What's interesting in this leaked document is it talks about preventing the consulates of the US and other Western countries from meeting with people who go against the CCP's line. That could include human rights activists. That could include people who could reveal information on the CCP. Now, I've joked before that journalists, diplomatic staff in China, they're living in the Truman Show. A lot of them know that's the case. In other words, everything around them is being shown to them intentionally by the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP puts a lot of effort into showing them a false picture of the CCP that aligns with the picture it wants to show to the rest of the world. Everyone down to the cleaning lady at their hotel room is going to be brought by the Chinese Communist Party. Everything is going to be delicately arranged by the Chinese Communist Party, and this new leaked document helps outline some of those findings. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first off, the United Nations is being criticized for allowing countries with poor human rights records to be elected to its Human Rights Council. Among the 15 countries elected on October 13th are China, Russia, Cuba, Pakistan, and others. Human Rights Foundation wrote in a statement ahead of the election that they and other human rights groups in the United States, Europe, and Canada are opposing the UN, allowing authoritarian regimes to serve on the UN Human Rights Council from 2021 to 2023. It says, quote, though these states are among the world's worst human rights abusers, if elected, their representatives will have the power to oversee the most important international human rights mechanisms. Now, alongside the announcement, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo noted in a statement that in 2018, President Trump withdrew the United States from the UN Human Rights Council due to its established anti-Israel bias and also membership rules, he said, quote, allow for the election of the world's worst human rights abusers to seats on the council. Now, before the U.S. withdrew, Pompeo said, it urged UN member states to immediately reform its Human Rights Council before it reached a state beyond repair. But noted these calls were left unheeded. And Pompeo said, quote, these elections only further validate the U.S. decision to withdraw and use other venues and opportunities to protect and promote universal human rights. Now remember what happened after the U.S. pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council. Now before all of this happened, before it pulled out, the UN Human Rights Council was the de facto international body for dealing with human rights abuses in different countries in the world. Countries often went through that council to deal with human rights abuses. And often, more often than not, Different countries like the Chinese Communist Party continued abusing people's human rights regardless of what was said at that council, because China was one of its members and still is one of its members. Now, after the US pulled out, what did it do? Rather than go through the United Nations, it began sanctioning individual CCP officials and individual Chinese Communist Party businesses for their involvement in human rights abuses, including in Xinjiang against the Uyghur Muslims and in Hong Kong for the CCP ending its autonomy. The US went after these officials and their businesses directly rather than go through the United Nations, and the effect has been a lot harder hitting than whatever happened before this. Now also, in addition to this, the United Nations Human Rights Council has been partly responsible itself for human rights abuses. You might remember one of the cases we reported on previously. Epoch Times had a story on it. The United Nations invited different people to testify about human rights abuses in China. And what happened? The United Nations Human Rights Council provided the names of those individuals to Chinese Communist Party authorities. As they were leaving to go testify about abuses they were facing in China, Chinese authorities arrested them. One of them died in custody. The UN Human Rights Council was responsible for that. It released their names to the CCP. And then what happened? The whistleblower who warned about this happening, who told the world what happened in the Human Rights Council, was herself punished by the United Nations. Now also, the CCP maintains standards that prevent its UN appointees from being independent. Typically what happens, if an official from any country in the world is assigned to the United Nations, they need to set aside their normal allegiances, set aside their normal international allegiances. They can no longer recognize themselves as being, say, a Chinese official or a British official or a US official. They are an official of the United Nations. The Chinese Communist Party does not allow that. They need to maintain the interests of the CCP at their roles at the United Nations. You might remember, for example, the head of Interpol, a Chinese national, who was punished by the CCP, allegedly for not closely following the CCP's guidance. And so the Chinese Communist Party, even these individuals appointed to the UN, maintains control over them. On October 13th, President Donald Trump stated to supporters at Johnston Airport in Pennsylvania that, quote, if Biden wins, China wins. All these other countries win. And he also stated,
I will deliver optimism, opportunity, and growth. They will deliver pessimism, stagnation, decline, and very high taxes. Simply put, it's a choice between a socialist nightmare and the American dream. China unleashed the virus onto the world, and only a Trump administration will hold them accountable. And if this administration, if I don't get elected in a little while, 20 days, China will own the United States. I can tell you that.
Now, when it comes to the Democratic Party in its current state, there are really many different parties. You have some who are more centrist, classical liberal types. You do have the classical Democrats still in the party. A lot of the voters, I'd say, are still like that. But there are also very far-left individuals who are pulling the party along. Many of the protesters, for example, Antifa, communist organizations, Marxists who infiltrated movements like, for example, Black Lives Matter, and who've spoken about it on video. Individuals like this are pulling the grassroots of the party. And then you have, of course, Democratic Socialists of America and other far-left organizations that do have these far-left ideologies. Now, Kamala Harris has been accused previously of being one of the furthest left individuals in the political system of the Democrats, even allegedly further left than Bernie Sanders. And so Trump's statements on this are not without reason. And also, of course, some of Biden's policies are built on these systems as well. For example, his economic system and also his environmental system are built in the framework of the Green New Deal. That was AOC and the Squad. And of course, they also have the reinvigoration of Obama's healthcare plan, not just getting rid of it like Trump wants to, but instead going the opposite direction, making it stronger and bringing in more types of socialist healthcare. Many of Biden's policies are more socialist in terms of bringing in more government control over institutions, over unions, when it comes to taxes and other policies. And so Trump's statements on this are not without reason, again. Now, Biden, for his part, is he a socialist? Does he believe in these things? Hard to say. We can say that his policies are more socialist, and there are Marxists and extremists within his party who he has not disavowed. In other news, history is being rewritten in the United States, and the story that's now being taught to children in today's schools is one that frames America as a government built on racism and slavery. But is this really the case, or is this an alteration of history? To learn more about this, we've invited to speak with us Alex Newman. He is an award-winning journalist and co-author of the book Crimes of the Educators: How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. Let's jump into that now. Hey, Alex Newman, great having you back on Crossroads.
It's great to be back. Thank you very much, Josh.
So one of the big topics right now in the U.S. is the idea of what's being taught in schools. Trump is going against what he calls this kind of anti-America education, where people are being taught, essentially, according to him at least, to hate the United States, to hate its foundations, to hate its founding stories. I know some of your work writing for Epoch Times and your columns, your opinion columns, you've written about the history of this type of education and what is actually being taught to students in our schools. Can you give us just a brief recap of what is the situation? What is really being taught to kids right now?
On the history front, it is really a complete and total reversal of reality, Josh. And one of the things that encourages me the most is that the President of the United States is now talking about this. In his Independence Day speech at Mount Rushmore, he said the reason for the mayhem on our streets is that our children are being indoctrinated in public schools. So he said, against every law of nature and society, our children are being taught to hate their own country. They're being taught that our heroes are actually villains, and it's all based on lies. He hit the nail right smack on the head. That's what I've been arguing for years. And I think that is, as the president suggested, the reason why we have this mess. And so what I did in my latest column for the Times was look at this fake history that they're teaching. And when I say it's a complete and total reversal of reality, that's what I mean. That's not hyperbole. That's not exaggeration. So, one of the things that used to define us as Americans was the incredible founding documents and the principles that were enshrined in there. The principles, as stated in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and that everyone is endowed by their creator with unalienable rights. This is at the heart of what it means to be a nation in America. This is the heart of our story as a country. And yet the totalitarians, understanding full well that the historical narrative is crucial to moving forward for their agenda, have flipped that upside down. Instead of our founding principles being equality and God-given rights, our founding principles are slavery, oppression, racism, white supremacy, and these types of things. And I think the clearest illustration of that, Josh, is the 1619 Project that came out of the New York Times. Now, to give you an example of how bad and how fake this history is, the Times' own fact checker said this was fake and that they couldn't run with it. She wrote an article in Politico about, I told them this was wrong and that they couldn't publish this, and they did it anyway. It's, again, a total reversal. So, America was founded on these principles. What this New York Times series that now has become a school curriculum is being taught all over the country in history posits is that America was not about liberty. The true birthday of America is not 1776. Instead, America is about slavery. She said, we have this embedded in our DNA, which you can't change your DNA. There's no reforms. There's no policy changes. There's no civil war you could fight that could possibly get this corrupted DNA out of you. And so what she's really saying is, as the mullahs say in Iran, death to America, right? You got to kill America to get rid of this horrible DNA. And it could not be more wrong. In fact, if anybody bothers to read the writings of the founding fathers, almost to a man, they loathed slavery. They recognized that this was not compatible with the Christian principles upon which they founded this country. They wanted to abolish it. They recognized that it would take time, but that was their goal. In fact, Thomas Jefferson tried to do it right away in the Declaration of Independence. James Madison, the father of our Constitution, loathed slavery and wrote about this in many occasions. And it was really these principles that America was founded on that led to the abolishing of slavery, not just here in America, but ultimately all over the world. And it took a long time, but there was no non-Christian movement to abolish slavery. In fact, one of the first wars that Thomas Jefferson fought was against slave catchers in North Africa who were capturing Americans off the high seas and enslaving them. Okay. So she's got the history totally wrong. And yet this is what's being taught to our children. They have been brought up now to believe that America is this uniquely evil nation responsible for the evil of slavery, rather than understanding the truth that Americans might have tolerated it a little longer than they probably should have. But this is a scourge that has been with humanity from the beginning of time. Almost every civilization, almost every culture throughout all of human history has practiced some form of slavery, and yet Americans did away with it because of the principles that this country was founded on. None of that comes through, and that's why our children hate America. That's why they're burning down our cities, Josh.
And this is interesting because when you talk about psychological warfare or worldview warfare, one of the things the Chinese Communist Party does, of course, a lot of my work is around that. One of the main things they do is they run psychological warfare operations. They have what they call the three warfares doctrine: psychological warfare, media warfare, legal warfare. But when you get into the idea of psychological warfare or worldview warfare, whatever you want to call it, what you're doing is you're not necessarily changing information. You could, but typically what it means is changing the interpretation of information. And this is done by altering these stories, altering the narratives. One interesting thing is that when Howard Zinn wrote the book, People's History of the United States, he reframed a lot of the founding stories. Funny enough, Howard Zinn, and his narratives are used now as one of the main foundations of modern anti-American historical arguments. Really, he was criticized by a lot of other historians at the time for, one, not using standard practices with history, two, for misrepresenting a lot of information. A few interesting things that he did. When he wrote about Christopher Columbus, and really a lot of people who don't like Columbus, their views are very likely shaped by what Zinn wrote. When he wrote about Christopher Columbus, he looked at Columbus's journal, and he would begin a statement, a quote, on one page, and he would write an ellipsis, like the ... And he would continue the quote not a few words later, but a few pages later, totally misrepresenting the context, totally misrepresenting the information, and totally misrepresenting what Columbus was talking about. The other big thing he did was he pinned the crimes against humanity, I guess we could call them, of the Spanish conquistadors, who were the ancestors of a lot of Latin America, on the American pilgrims. In other words, altering the narrative of who these types of, you could argue what was the nature of them, but arguing these genocides should be pinned on the United States, not on Latin America. And so, using these different methods, it has changed the very foundation of the way this country is interpreted, changed the very foundations of the founding stories that form what we call the mythos. How do you perceive values? How do you perceive right and wrong that people use as their operating mechanism for interpreting reality? I'm curious, I know a lot of your work revolves around investigating and exposing these things. What is the new mythos being presented to America's youth?
Yeah, you just it summed up so many things just perfectly right there, Josh. And Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, is now one of the most popular history books. It's sold more than 3 million copies. And so for my column, I interviewed Dr. Mary Grabar, who just wrote a book debunking Howard Zinn's lies. And what she says is, in many cases, he just outright lies. He just makes stuff up that's not true. In other cases, he does, as you just mentioned, blatant deception by using ellipses where they don't belong, trying to paint things differently. He does paint Christopher Columbus as a genocidal maniac, when if you actually read his own diaries, that is very clearly not what he was about. In fact, one of the things that he believed he was doing was acting in God's service. He wanted to bring the Bible and the gospel and Christianity to people who, in his worldview, didn't have this glorious light that God had revealed to man. And actually, he writes in his diary that he felt prompted by the Holy Spirit to go on this journey. None of that comes through Howard Zinn's propaganda. And you're right about what happened in Latin America as well. It's so obvious. I actually grew up in Latin America, and so very familiar with the history of Latin America, with the Portuguese, with the Spaniards, some of what happened. Some of it was absolutely barbaric. And it's especially interesting because America has some history on that too, and it completely debunks Howard Zinn's thesis. In fact, not far from where I live, we had a group of French Huguenots, French Protestants, who had settled on the coast of Florida. And what happened was the Catholic Spaniards actually arrived and slaughtered them all. It's a very well-known story locally. It didn't make it into Howard Zinn's textbook, unsurprisingly, because it doesn't contribute to the narrative that America is this evil, horrible nation. And that really is the underlying worldview that Howard Zinn and the 1619 Project, which incidentally, the Communist Party of China has been openly celebrating this 1619 Project. They love the fact that it's being taught in schools now. We shouldn't be surprised by that. They're celebrating this in their propaganda organs. because if you can force Americans through propaganda, through brainwashing, through lies, through indoctrination, misinformation and disinformation and psychological warfare to hate their own country, suddenly the Americans will dismantle their own country on their own. You don't have to worry about their military or their economic power. They'll just, burn their own country up. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's incredibly dangerous. It is based on lies. That's one of the big advantages that we have, is the truth, I believe, is much more powerful than lies. Anybody can go look at the primary source documents and investigate these things for themselves and see what really happened. But it's very, very clear what's going on here. The Communist Chinese understood this. The Cultural Revolution, one of the big elements of the Cultural Revolution was the wiping out of the true history. China was this incredible civilization with thousands of years of amazing, incredible history that contributed so much to humanity. The communists wanted to wipe all of that out. So they were burning books and they were pulling down statues and setting libraries on fire and murdering people who knew real history so that they could start from a blank slate. And then everything prior to the Communist Revolution became evil, backwards, uncivilized, barbarous, and so on. Everything post-Communist Revolution was wonderful and glorious and all the rest of it. That is exactly the same thing they're trying to do in America. And it's the same thing they've done around the world.
Now, with that said, folks, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also every Sunday, I do a live Q&A, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you want to support us also, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find the link to the Crossroads Patreon page in the description below this video. If you haven't already also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps our channel. And if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads and consider sharing this video. Now, that said, folks, again, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.